Welcome back, everyone, and welcome to our second video dealing with the period known as Reconstruction. The last time we spoke, President Andrew Johnson, believing himself firmly in control of Reconstruction with his very lenient policy of handing pardons out like candy, that sets him up on a collision course with Congress that is dominated by radical Republicans who do not particularly care for his excessively lenient policy towards particularly leaders of the Confederacy. Already, we know that there's been a couple of blows exchanged. Congress tried to pass the Freedmen's Bureau Act to expand the Freedmen's Bureau to include purchasing land for ex-slaves, pass the Civil Rights Act of 1866 in order to get the South to stop passing black codes. Johnson vetoed both of them. Doesn't matter. They were overturned by Congress. And then lastly, they tried to they did pass the 14th Amendment, which of course Johnson was against, but it doesn't matter. Giving citizenship rights to everybody in this country, no matter what your color is, equal protection of the laws. States now had to respect your due process rights and could not deny your privileges and immunities. So that's, already, Congress has set itself up on a collision course with the president with the intent of taking Reconstruction away from the president. And then here comes the elections of 1866. Johnson has so much dislike for these people in Congress that he actually goes on a speaking tour trying to convince people don't vote for the radicals. The radicals are just as bad as the secessionists. The election happens, and wouldn't you know it, even more people elect radicals to Congress. In the 40th Congress, it's going to come to office in 1867 as 82% Republican, and the Senate is led by longtime abolitionist Senator Charles Sumner, a Republican from Massachusetts, and in the House, Representative Thaddeus Stevens, a Republican from Pennsylvania. Both of these gentlemen were leaders, architects, authors of the 13th Amendment and the 14th Amendment, and they're going to lead the charge to put President Johnson in his place. And one of the rare occurrences in American history, Congress is going to establish or attempt to establish dominance over the president. And one of the first things they do as soon as they get elected with that much larger Republican majority is basically they decide we're going to wipe the slate clean. They're not happy with Reconstruction and the states being allowed to rejoin the Union, neither under the Lincoln Plan or in the Johnson Plan. So they pass a series of laws called the Reconstruction Acts, which of course are vetoed by Johnson, but it doesn't matter. They have more than enough numbers to overturn those vetoes. And the Reconstruction Acts become law in 1867. So long story short, let me read you the conditions of the Reconstruction Act. Remember all those states that were allowed to come back into the Union under the Lincoln or the Johnson plan? Yeah, all that's null and void. It doesn't count anymore. And this was done in part because many of these states were taking their sweet time in ratifying the 14th Amendment. And it seemed that Johnson didn't care. So you're all out. So forget about everything that we might have said beforehand. Tennessee is the only one that's left alone, but the 10 remaining states of the Confederacy kicked out. Um, you're going to have to fulfill other conditions to come back in. We're going to divide the South into 5 military districts, each under martial law with a military governor. Okay. So your state governments will be dissolved, your state constitutions will be dissolved, you will be governed directly by the military under martial law until you do the things that Congress tells you to do, and therefore Congress will be satisfied and will allow you to re-enter the Union. While the Army is there, they will be there protecting civil rights, essentially acting as a law enforcement force on the ground. The Army will be in charge of registering voters, particularly black voters, and supervising elections to make sure that no nonsense happens when black people try to vote. What are they going to have to fulfill? What does Congress want? Congress wants the voters in each district. This must be black and white voters. Nobody could be denied the right to vote here because the 14th Amendment, Section 2, okay, says that Congress will penalize any state that restricts the vote to any black male by reducing their number of representation. Nobody wants that. So this is going to be the first instance. This is not the 15th Amendment, but under the conditions and demands of the Reconstruction Act plus Section 2 of of Amendment 14, blacks for the first time are going to be voting in many of these states. It's the demand of Congress. As those black and white voters will vote in a state constitutional convention that will write a new state constitution. The requirements of these state constitutions that you will give black men the right to vote and you will ratify the 14th Amendment. So do that. Vote in a constitutional convention by both black and white voters. Choose delegates to this convention. Draft a new state constitution. Um, ratify the 14th Amendment. Uh, allow blacks to vote. In the election to form a state government, blacks will be a vote and when all that is done, then the Congress will let you back in. Johnson, of course, vetoed all of this, considered it a gross violation of states' rights, and it was. Very rarely in American history do you see the federal government come in and take complete control over the state like like it did during the Reconstruction period. It absolutely did. States' rights for a time being fell by the wayside, and it was the federal government that was dominant, particularly under the Reconstruction Acts. But they felt it was necessary because these states were not acting in true faith to resolve, remedy um, the situation of 4 million ex-slaves. They simply didn't seem like they cared. And Congress is going to make sure that that would change. Famous image, not just the Union soldier, but the Freedmen's Bureau agent served as a stabilizing force, a force of law and order in the South, quite often protecting newly freedmen from the violence of vengeful white Southerners who were upset they couldn't have, many of them still couldn't vote, they didn't have the right to hold office, and yet here they are um, watching as their world, the world that they can't, they knew and were born into, is turned upside down, and Union soldiers are there to make sure it happens. And here's a picture, a map showing, by November of 1867, where were the troops stationed, and in what numbers. Okay, and of course these numbers start to decline over time. But frankly, if you take into consideration the range that they could cover, they had significant parts of the South um, under their protection, if you will. It's the problem is if you were outside that range, you were vulnerable. So let's return to the issue of the freedmen after the war. Yes, they were cheated with any promise of land reparation. That didn't happen. Many of them were cajoled into the convict system by being charged with things as ludicrous as vagrancy and finding themselves on a chain gang. And by 1870, 90% of Southern inmates are black. They were sucked into that or into sharecropping, the vast majority of them, because they knew nothing else and had nowhere else to go, and they needed to feed their families and put a roof over their heads. And so they locked themselves into the cycle of poverty we call sharecropping. But whereas there were negatives, there are a lot of positives. Let's talk about black citizenship that was born in the 14th Amendment. And blacks, for the first time, involving themselves in the politics of this country at the national, the state, and the local level. Not yet the 15th Amendment, but already. with the Reconstruction Acts, many blacks are going to find themselves voting for the first time, and they're going to make their vote count, and they're going to vote in very large numbers. Over 1,500 black men, most of them free black men, that moved to the South after the war will be elected to offices across the South. Mayors, sheriffs at the local level, state legislature. Look at South Carolina. A significant number of South Carolina's lower house of the state legislature was African American. And some even made it to the federal level. And when they governed, what did they do? And here, this is a period, this is a topic of debate between those, much like the lost cause theory folks that claim that Reconstruction was a disaster, that we gave the vote to people and the ability to hold office to people that were not ready for it, and others that claim that's racist nonsense. On the contrary, the record says something quite different. How did what if there was a common thread behind most of these Republican dominated? Because when they first started voting, guess what? They voted Republican. In fact, blacks would identify with the Republican Party until pretty much the 1930s. Before that, they were always Republicans until about the beginning of the 1930s. And what did they do? Well, they spent their money on, heaven forbid, schools, the expansion of schools, the expansion of public education, the improvement of roads and bridges, infrastructure projects, public works projects, hospitals, things that we refer to today as, government spending on public services and things of that nature. And how did they pay for it? With a new tax system that began to spread throughout the South, which we have with us today. In the antebellum period, Southern governments collected tax revenue through a slave tax. You paid a tax per every slave that you owned, which is kind of crazy. That means each state's revenue was dependent on the number of human beings that were owned in that state, and actually it encouraged. Okay, the more human beings would be brought into that state in bondage, that was more tax dollars for the state. Well, since slavery is no longer legal, these Reconstruction governments had to find another means by which to collect tax revenue, and they introduced the now known as property tax or the land tax. You were taxed by amount of land that you owned. Who's this going to upset? The landowners, particularly the ones that's all they have left. And it was from the taxes on land, on property, that they're going to pay for all these projects. Was there corruption? Sure, there was. There was corruption both in the South and the North, black politicians and white politicians. But many folks that opposed these Reconstruction governments tried to convince the public that it was black politicians that were doing this, that were wastefully spending. So let's talk a bit about, and it's a bit exaggerated also. Yes, despite the very large number of black voters and black office holders, they never controlled a state legislature. They only elected one governor very briefly, and whites still continued to be the dominant uh, faces that you found in Southern politics, despite the black vote. Let's talk about those that opposed these so-called radical governments throughout the South. As you can tell in that illustration, they did not paint it in the most flattering terms, and quite often those terms steered into highly predictable um, arguments based on racism and supposed superiority. You see that caption of that picture: colored rule in a reconstructed state. The members call each other thieves, liars, rascals, and cowards. Okay. The truth of it was there was something uh, with greater gravity at the root of this. Okay, and much of the opposition to these Reconstruction governments, we hear it in political talk today. Let's look at Johnson, because Johnson was one of the people most opposed to these governments. Just like he opposed land reparations, he opposed the Freedmen's Bureau, And he opposed the Civil Rights Act. He opposed them all on the grounds that he believed that they were handouts, undeserved handouts, and violations of states' rights. The arguments that he used against how these governments governed and the people that govern these governments fell back on the old tropes and the old arguments, traditional Southern racism, but this time gift wrapped to be more respectable, to be more presentable. Oh, no, no, no. It's not about race. I just hate seeing government misuse and misspend tax dollars. I have a problem with big government spending money on services and projects that are going to help people that don't deserve it. So, you get away from the explicit racist arguments and try to couch it into some kind of a concern for runaway government and runaway spending, when at the root of it, you just don't want to see tax money in your mind only paid by white people to spend being spent to better the lives of black people, which is ridiculous because a lot of poor whites also benefited from much of the spending on education and infrastructure. So yes, the argument was, big government and wasteful spending takes hard-working tax dollar from whites, from hard-working whites, and gives it to lazy blacks. And we may not be as explicit and say stuff like that out in the open anymore, but much of that anti-big government, anti-tax argument is very much rooted in the same arguments that attacked the Reconstruction governments throughout the South during that period. And they're not the only target of Southern hate, if you will. The carpetbagger and the scalawag was also an issue. Carpetbaggers, truth and fiction. The fiction first. Somebody that came with money from up north to move down south simply to take advantage of a ruined economy and property values that had plummeted dirt cheap and buy stuff dirt cheap and make themselves owners and basically enrich themselves at the expense of the misery of Southerners. And if this was true, maybe it was true, but it was also beneficial because remember, Southerners, right after the war, they had land, but they didn't have cash. And guess who's coming with cash to buy land? Many of these Northerners. And these Northerners, yes, are going to purchase land in the South, but they're also going to infuse money into the Southern economy through their investment. But was it always that? No. A lot of these so-called carpetbaggers were people that actually came to help, not to take away or to exploit. They were teachers, they were doctors, they were attorneys, they were, well, social workers didn't exist, but a lot of Freeman's Bureau agents were seen as carpetbaggers as well. Yes, some of them came to for the with the precise intent of running for office in the South. A lot of free blacks came from the North with the intent of running for office in the South. And the term comes from a cheap piece of luggage that looked like a carpet folded in half that was in vogue at the time. The scalawag might have actually been worse. The scalawag was a white Southerner, once upon a time a Democrat, but now jumping on the bandwagon, wanting to win because now all these governments are Republican dominated and becoming a Republican. And that was a traitor. And there was no more infamous scalawag than General James Longstreet, famous general of the Army of Northern Virginia that fought alongside Lee at Gettysburg and many other battles. Once he became a Republican, all of a sudden, all the blame is thrown on him for having lost. Pretty interesting. Now let's get back to the White House. And needless to say, it's been a rough couple of years. The relationship between Congress and President Johnson is not a very friendly one. And the relationship between Johnson and his cabinet is not a good one either. Johnson kept everybody that Lincoln had in his cabinet for the most part. And Johnson, wanting to surround himself with loyalists, he already had enough trouble in Congress. who needs trouble in the cabinet as well, wants to get rid of certain people. No more than Edwin Stanton, because Edwin Stanton was a full-blown abolitionist. Edwin Stanton was very much in the radical Republican camp, and Johnson wanted him out. And Congress smelt this coming from a mile away. So they passed two laws pretty much at the same time they write the Reconstruction Acts. The Tenure of Office Act and the Command of Army Act. The Tenure of Office Act prohibited the president from removing any cabinet position without Senate approval. Command of the Army Act, very similar, prohibited the president from removing the commanding general of the army without the Senate's approval. Now, if you remember, Johnson had already been courting General Grant for a while. He knew he was not the prettiest, most charismatic, most loved and liked figure in American politics, but he knew that Grant was. And if he could create the illusion, the impression that him and Grant were close, then maybe this would help him in his political future, this association. He wants to get rid of Stanton, and he plans to put Grant in that position as Secretary of War. And of course, Congress sees this coming, and they pass these two acts to make sure he does it. So what Johnson does, he waits until Congress is out of session, and he gives the job. He fires Stanton, which is a bit of a scene in itself, gives the job to Grant, but Grant's already in on it. It's a setup. Okay, this is the part that Johnson doesn't get. This is all a setup. They knew he was going to do it a certain way, and it all fell into place. Johnson fires Stanton, offers the job to Grant, who immediately resigns from the job, leaving the office vacant. Not only that, but now Johnson in violation of two federal laws. Because not only did he fire the Secretary of War, violating the Tenure of Office Act, but to make Grant the new Secretary of War, he had to stop being the commanding general of the Army, violating the Command of Army Act. Johnson tries to scramble the best he could. Last minute names one of the few allies he had, General Lorenzo Thomas, as the new Secretary of War, but the deed is done. They got him right where they want him in violation of two federal laws. Within a year, they're going to impeach President Johnson. And President Johnson is going to have to infamously will be known as the first president in American history to be impeached. Now, let me explain to you what this means. A lot of people think this means removed from office. No. Impeached is a two-part process. It starts in the House of Representatives. It starts in the House of Representatives, where the House brings up, the same way a prosecutor would bring up charges, the House brings up articles, um, meaning charges against the president for having committed acts of crime, high crimes and misdemeanors. That's what the Constitution says are grounds for impeachment. The House comes up with 11 articles justifying the impeachment of President Johnson. Basically, this is why President Johnson should be removed from office. All 11 articles pass, 126 to 47, with 17 representatives abstaining. The charges: violating the Tenure of Office Act, conspiracy with General Thomas Lorenzo, and now the second stage. Step two is a trial, because the president also enjoys due process. Okay, so the charges were brought up in the House. The trial takes place in the Senate, presided over by the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court at the time, former Secretary of the Treasury, now Chief Justice Salmon Chase. And like in any other trial, the president has an opportunity to defend himself against these charges, these so-called articles. The trial accepted 3 out of 11 articles to charge President Johnson with. Ultimately, the objective of a Senate trial, if they find him guilty, is to remove the president from office. So that's the final step of this two-step process. So they hold a trial. Um, and at the end, on March 13th, 1868, there was a ticket apparently to go see the impeachment of the president. Um, on all three charges, each needed a two-thirds majority vote to pass. All three charges failed to get a guilty verdict, a vote, and therefore in each one of those charges, each one of those articles, President Johnson was saved by one vote and was not removed from office. So he's the first president impeached, but no, he is not successfully removed from office during his Senate trial. He is saved by one vote for each one of the three articles he was charged in. Doesn't matter. Johnson's not going to be any more trouble. He's pretty much a lame duck now. Wait a minute, he is going to be a little bit more trouble, but towards the end. Just be patient. With this move, Congress, under the radical Republicans, is now firmly in control of the country, firmly in control of Reconstruction. And that's just something, if you want to pause it later on and check it out, you can. The election of 1868. Guess what? That whole setup to impeach Johnson, that Grant was in on it, of course he was in on it. Because he had already been spoken to. He was the favorite to run for the presidency. He was the most favorite person in the country at the time. Tell you the truth, both the Republicans and the Democrats wanted to run Ulysses Grant as president. He just happened to run for the Republican ticket. Actually, Johnson was upset that neither the Republicans ran him for re-election. He was a little clueless about just how people felt about him in reality. That's why he's like one of the worst presidents ever. And he was also upset. He didn't understand why the Democrats didn't run him to run against Grant. So this is the end of his political career. Oh, but he doesn't leave without making a mess. On Christmas Day in 1868, he pardons 150,000 former Confederates, giving them back their right to vote and their right to run for office. So that if that was to poison the well, it did what it did. Well, long story short, as you can see the numbers here, General Grant walks away with 73% of the popular vote, 53% of the popular vote, 214 electoral votes to become the new president, the 18th president of the United States. Congress loses, Republicans lose a couple of seats in Congress, but are able to retain a majority. And this Congress is unique because this election is the first election where a sizable number of black voters for the first time cast their vote. In fact, President Grant was helped by 500,000 black votes that were cast in his favor. And this worries the Republicans. See, listen, we got by this time, 53%, I think it was. So next time we may not be so lucky. Let's do something about that. Let's go back to the map of where the army was. Here you could tell like what areas were Democrat and what areas were Republican. Like, for example, Eastern Tennessee was thoroughly on the Republican side. But then you have states like Georgia that were still firmly Democrat. Louisiana was firmly Democrat. Um, and it's kind of juxtaposed where the troops were. The next image, that's where the percentage of the black population was. And you'll notice where the black population was most heavily concentrated, you also have heavy concentrations of troop presence. And of course, that makes sense. That was to protect them from any kind of violence or discrimination while they exercised their right to vote. As soon as Grant gets elected and the 41st Congress takes office, they have the people, they have, it's the will there. They're going to pass the 15th Amendment. And this was the result itself of a long debate. Should we go for universal suffrage, which many, early feminists were hoping for? Or should we only give the vote to black men? And apparently, we were not ready for universal suffrage. Unfortunately, people like Susan B. Anthony would be opposed to the 15th Amendment because it did not include women. Um, but it did what it did. It extended and made it law by constitutional amendment that the vote could not be denied to anybody on account of their race. So the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any other state on the account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Passed February 26, 1869. Ratified, that takes a while because, by the time the 15th Amendment is passed, there's still a number of states that drag their feet. And now they're going to have the 15th added to their conditions. Here's an image showing, um, well, all the changes that had happened to African Americans. Just you have to keep in mind, this is 1870, and the blacks were only freed 5 years earlier. And in these 5 years, they have run for office, they have voted, they have taken office, they've gone to school, they've gotten married. Uh, the list is down there. They're free to join associations to run their own churches. Um, Life was transformed incredibly so for many African Americans. Maybe not most of them, but for many African Americans, just in the last 5 years, radical changes. And here's an image. Yes, many white Southerners were not happy, especially the ones that had yet to have their rights restored. That now, um, former slaves, 4 or 5 years ago, now had the right to vote. And they weren't going to vote Democrat. They were going to vote Republican. They were going to vote in Republican governments. Political first. The first black, that election of 1870 brought us the first black members of the House of Representatives. 6 men were elected to the House of Representatives. First ever African American elected to the Senate. Senator Hiram Revels of Mississippi, which we'll talk about in a second. First ever state governor, first black governor, Governor of Louisiana, PBS Pinchback, although unfortunately he only serves about a month. And then, of course, we have to return to Robert Smalls, a hero of the Civil War that steals a Confederate boat, is kind of made a pilot of that boat, and pilots several expeditions, battles throughout around the Carolinas. And then after the war, he's a senator for South Carolina at the state level, a state representative, then a state senator, and then he serves in the House of Representatives. And here we are back with Senator Hiram Revels. And the interesting note about Hiram Revels, and he didn't serve long either. You never guess who was the senator in Mississippi before Mr. Revels became the senator of Mississippi. None other than Jefferson Davis. And so that's what that illustration is pointing fun at. Jefferson Davis looking over his shoulder at his old desk to find a black man sitting there. And Hiram Revels was a free black. He was not born into slavery. He was a pastor. He was educated. He came down to Mississippi with the express purpose of running for office. And by the time the 15th Amendment is passed, there's still four states that are holdouts. They don't want to do it. They haven't ratified the 14th. They haven't ratified the 15th. They haven't formed new state governments or constitutions or anything. Well, because you waited so long, you're going to have to ratify the 15th as well. And so they eventually do. Okay, by February of 1870, the last four finally come around to it. And by the time we get to that, then all 10 former states of the Confederacy, I mean, the districts still stand. The five districts still stand, but by the time we get to, I guess it would be February of 1870, um, all 10 former states of the Confederacy already have new reconstructed governments in accordance with the new demands of Congress. But some people are just not going to tolerate that. Some people were raised to believe that the white man was superior to the black man, that slavery was the natural order. And okay, maybe they had to live with the end of slavery, but then they were also told to live with the idea of political and social equality, and now the black vote, when so many of them still did not have the right to vote or hold office. So, what are they going to do? So long as black people voted and voted in large numbers, they would have a very large, if not dominant, voice in their state legislatures. Okay. And many, many whites would be shut out. Well, I know people like to say that violence never solves anything. Unfortunately, history says quite the opposite. It did solve quite a few things for these people. Several groups began to emerge as a reaction, particularly to the 15th Amendment. Groups like the Knights of the White Camellia, the White League, or the one probably everybody knows in class, the Ku Klux Klan, the Brotherhood of the Circle. What were they? White supremacist terrorist organizations. Their whole objective is the way to get black people to stop voting is to terrorize them and murder them and intimidate them. And eventually, all of that will work towards them choosing not to vote anymore because it will be hazardous to the health and the health of their family. The end game was if we scare enough black people away from the ballot box, they won't vote, whites will vote, and will return their sovereign governments back to white men and the Democratic Party. They will redeem the South from what they saw as Negro misrule. That's the term that they would have used. And yes, I know that doesn't look like the Klan that you imagine. That's because the Klan you imagine with the pointy hoods and the white robes, that didn't come around to about the turn of the century. The early Klan, the first Klan that was born in the ashes of the Civil War, of Reconstruction, they just wore anything available to hide their identities while they went out committing terror and murder. They targeted black families, particularly politically involved ones, particularly black voters, and carpetbaggers, who, a lot of times these are Freeman Bureau agents and teachers who they blamed for encouraging black people to vote and get politically involved. That man there, the picture of that man is none other than General Nathan Bedford Forrest. Apparently, he was the deadliest man in the Civil War with a verified body count of over 30 men. He was a cavalry officer. And he was one of the founding members of the Ku Klux Klan, founded in Pulaski, Tennessee in 1865. And they are going to be a troublesome organization. They're going to be trouble for the Freedmen's Bureau. and they're going to be trouble for ex-slaves. Wherever the army doesn't cover, they're going to terrorize those areas. And here's a famous image of the Klan visiting at night, terrorizing a family. The whole objective was to stop black people from voting. So eventually, um, with enough black people being murdered and terrorized away from voting, news gets to Washington, and the Grant administration decides to do something about it. In 1870 and 1871, they pass a series of laws meant at curtailing these. They didn't use the word terrorist groups, but these white terrorist groups. The Enforcement Act of 1870 prohibited states from discriminating against voters by race and would allow the federal government to prosecute violators directly, circumventing state courts. This is the first ever federal law that allows the federal government to prosecute citizens directly who have violated federal law. Before, the state always had to go first. Direct federal prosecution. And it declared groups like the Ku Klux Klan and the Knights of the White Camellia criminal organizations. They followed the following year um, with another enforcement act, which would allow the use of the military to protect the civil rights of black people, which is very much in vein of the Reconstruction Act, and would suspend habeas corpus of any violators of that act. But for reasons that we'll talk about next time, the Republicans are running low on public support. And by the following year, with actually the election of the next Congress, they pass an Amnesty Act. The Amnesty Act of 1872 basically forgives everybody that hasn't been forgiven yet. By 1872, there's no white Southerners, with very, very few exceptions. There's no white Southerners that are barred from voting or holding office, and that's important because they're going to use that to come back to power. Um, the election of 72 is interesting. We'll talk about it more because the Republican Party is split. Um, yes, that Congress still has, the senators gone, but members of the House are still there. But the Republican Party is experiencing a split by the time we get into the 1872 election. All right, guys, that's it for now. Kind of like on the long side. We'll finish this up next time.